Hello and welcome. We're going to be looking at, in this video, we're going to be looking at understanding and finding techniques in artworks and in posters. And basically what we're going to be looking at are all the various kinds of techniques that you can look at for not only for understanding symbols, but also layouts, images through different positionings, perspectives, styles, all those things. We're going to look at all the techniques that we can basically fit into this short video and try and get you on the right track in terms of where you go, in terms of looking for techniques and how you go about interpreting images. Okay, so basically using visual techniques or interpreting visual language is the same as what you do when you're interpreting written language, as in you'll use a number of different techniques, you'll try and find some technical terms for them, and that you'll basically try and put it all together in a package where you're not only describing a technique which is being used, but you're describing it using a specific technical term, which allows you to basically hit the nail on the head for what it is that image does. Okay, it requires you to understand the technical ways an image is arranged. So, as I mentioned before, that technical language that you'll be using. Okay, so moving on. The basic principle for interpreting a text is to essentially divide it into pieces. So if you have a look at the image up the top there, it's divided into images. Now, admittedly, it's not the most literal form of way that you'll be dividing an image, but it's essentially a way of looking at it, as in you've got a number of smaller pieces or smaller images making up a bigger image. So you can basically try and cut it down by the various objects in the scene, in terms of the different features, so whether it be the text, whether it be the layout, and just break it down into different pieces, like you've got different layers which you just put together when you've got the final image. So if you're someone who's into digital imaging, it's just like having different layers. All right. You also need to assign each piece a value, as in what it does and what it adds to the image, whether it's a symbolic piece to the image, whether it adds to it, whether it actually has an effect, its position, its size, and its shape. So basically make all these different considerations about it. Okay, the purpose of them is essentially describe an image and how it's composed, and you do it in relation to a couple of things. First of all, it's positioning. So the layout and positioning of images and text. So we looked for a couple of those considerations before when we were just mentioning that you look at the size and shape and layout. Well, that includes all of those things. And when you're describing it, you'll be using those to describe the positioning of things, how they're all arranged. Also be looking at the style, as in the details of images and the way that they're composed. So one looks at essentially the layout, where everything is placed, and one looks at the actual style and the way that a particular image is constructed as well. Now, these two things will overlap, and certainly the various things that make them up will also overlap. So you'll be looking at the symbols and the images here, and you'll be looking at the layout and the size and shape of images here if we were going to put them into those two different categories. But also, when we're looking at it, we're looking at in terms of the image and how it's set out, how it's put together. All right. So we'll start with positioning, because positioning is probably, as I mentioned before, not only is an important part, it's probably the most important part, because the prominence of a certain image basically entails what the message of it's going to be. So positional terms describe where everything is, and it's like your layers. It will orientate where everything is set out and where it's meant to go. And when you break this down, you can basically see it like it is a number of different aspects of the image, and if you put them all together, they form 3 dimensions. So to start with, you get your layers, as in your background layer, the things we see right at the back, the middle, and the foreground. Now the foreground is obviously the most prominent one, and it's the one which will often be your focal point. Your middle ground is your less important, and obviously your background is your least important. And often images are arranged to sort of start with that most prominent image, the one that really sticks out, and then to fade into the middle and background ones, or other parts of the image which are not quite as prominent as the one in the foreground. Now, you can also look at it in terms of quadrants, as in you can divide the image essentially into 4 quarters. and 4 even quarters. So you've got the top left quadrant, literally the top right quadrant, the bottom left and the bottom right. And it's dividing it evenly and allows you to indicate where a particular image or shape or prominence has been placed. The focal point is not always in the dead center. You may see the focal point moved into one of those quadrants, in which case you use those quadrants to describe where it is and where it's been placed. The frame, so the borders of image. So if you think of it like a camera, or the camera you're watching me on now, the frame is everything you see. So everything you see on screen here is what the frame is basically framing, for a lack of a better word. So when you're looking at this, it's everything that we're presenting to you, everything that you need to see. Outside of this frame is a whole heap of other things. There's a studio, there's all these other things which basically not really important and not really part of the image. So what you see is essentially what is framed. The focal point, so the center of attention. So what is the most important point? The vectors, so the lines in which you follow. So in terms of an image or in terms of a poster or an artwork, where you're basically looking beyond the focal point, which we mentioned before. Okay, let's move on to style terms. Now, style and technique terms basically inform how an image is made. All right, so it's about the image itself, how the artist has constructed it, how it's been made up, what it's made up of. So composition to start with, how it's made. So it could be simply a drawing, it could be something digital, it could be anything like that. Spatial cues, so basically your perspectives, modeling, things that indicate dimension and space. Now this is a style and technique feature because this is often incorporated into the artwork rather than being something that's done after the artwork has been made. So it includes various things that the artist has to do, not necessarily the one who is arranging the image or laying it out. If you're looking at it in terms of a poster, if you're just looking in terms of a basic artwork, then often the image itself is doctored to include all these things. So while it does overlap with a lot of the things that you'll be looking at with layout, often this is something that the artist has to look at as well, and the image itself is doctored to incorporate these sorts of perspectives and space, and especially if it wants to appear sort of three-dimensional, it's got to do that as well. Icons and symbols, so use of various items and graphics. So these sorts of things which are created to denote certain things. Icons which are essentially like symbols, but ones that you would use quite commonly, ones that immediately tell you where to go. Color and tone, so color schemes and shading. And you'll be looking at these in terms of not only the vibrancy of the color in terms of the color scheme, but the shading of it. So whether there's shadow, whether there's various things placed upon the image and the color of it, and even things like textures are also covered by this. And finally, contours, so the lines and shapes. Now this sort of relates to vectors, but it's the use of essentially very strong lines. It depends on the artist's style. So contours are essentially lines and shapes which are created by an artist, and they're used to essentially as part of the construction of the image. So it's part of the composition, it's part of including all of these things. So even though some of these things sort of cross over with layout, some of the layout terms also cross over with these. And depending on the type of image and depending on how it's been made, these may essentially overlap with the ones that you've just seen. Okay, and proportions. Not forgetting proportions, they're basically sizes relative to other parts of the image. And proportions are basically, especially if you're looking at it in terms of an artwork, how things have been proportioned. So you can make something look giant, you can make something look smaller, and depending on what the intent of the image is, you can essentially proportion things accordingly. So if you want to show someone's very intelligent, then often you'll proportion the top of the head to look like it's got a bigger brain in there. So fairly basic stuff, really. Okay, so what can you find? Now you find your techniques through reflection. And what that means is by reflecting on the image, by looking at it closely, by sort of looking backwards, as in thinking from the perspective of the viewer and then looking at the perspective of the creator, is you start to get an idea of what the message is or what you think the point of it is. You get the impression of the characters and what sort of characters have been used, whether they may be people, animals, or figures, and particularly if they are not people and if they are animals or stick figures or something along those lines, why they've been used. And if you're looking at it in terms of a poster, in terms of an educational point of view, you probably won't be looking at stick figures unless they're a deliberate stick figure. So it's not because the person can't draw. It's going to be for another purpose. The style and mood as well. So what do you feel about the image when you see it? Why do you feel it? And again, this is a very important thing to do when you're reflecting upon it. And certainly it's one of the things that you can only get for a reflection on it, as in this sort of feeling. So what you feel when you see a light at the end of the tunnel and that connotation that comes with it. The focus, where you look first. So what stood out to you? What was the focal point for you when you first looked at it? Because it's probably the focal point. The attention, what is being highlighted? What grabs your attention first up? What you really feel is the most attention-grabbing piece. How does the image itself actually grab attention? And certainly with a poster, you'd be looking at it in terms of something that is quite attention-grabbing. And especially as with all posters, they're trying to sort of scream over the top of each other. So it will have something highlighted that's very, very important to it. And response, what is it basically trying to get you to think? So images are constructed, and certainly any kind of visual text is constructed to get you to respond to it in some way. So whether it's a movie poster and your response to the poster is, yes, let's go see that movie, or whether the response is to feel horrified, shocked, whether it's to feel joy, whether it's to simply feel awe, as in, oh my God, this guy is such a great artist. All of those things are trying to get a response, and that may be the response it's trying to get. Okay, so what do these techniques represent? So how can you start discussing these things? First of all, you're discussing the ideas, as in what the artist, what the composer of this image is trying to get you to think. So the thoughts and themes which are basically stimulated by an image or images. You may be looking at the feelings, as in things which make a connection with you. And certainly, any kind of image, as with any kind of text, is going to try and make a connection with you in some way. And if you're looking at it in terms of an artwork's constantly trying to reach out to their audiences, trying to make them feel something when they see it. An artwork which makes you feel nothing when you see it is a bad artwork. It's not something that really has any quality to it. So any artist is trying to do that. The target audience is essentially the specific group or image it may be trying to connect with. So if you're looking at it in terms of a poster, if it's a movie poster for one thing, it's already got its target audience in mind, like you look at when you're looking at an ad. But also, it may be simply that it's just trying to get people to relate to that point of view, and that may only be a certain group of people who relate to it. So a lot of art may be looking at very open-minded people, not necessarily the closed-minded. And a purpose, the overall aim and intent of the image. So what is it trying to do? Why is it there? Why is this being constructed? And ultimately, this is the main thing that dictates what an artwork or what a visual piece is trying to do, is it's got a purpose and it's got a reason for being. Whether it's to sell, whether it's to be an illustration, whether it's simply there to make people feel something when they see it, it's got a purpose. And every image that you look at has some sort of purpose. Okay, so in summary, an image can basically be analysed by both its positioning and its style. So look at it in terms of the way it's arranged and the way that it's been made. You find this through reflection. So make sure that whenever you're trying to interpret an image, that you reflect on it, you think about it, and that you don't immediately stick with your first answer, nor do you get frustrated if it doesn't immediately come out to you. And finally, these techniques represent essentially the intent of the image. So through understanding and identifying all the things that form part of the image, you're getting to understand what the meaning of it is. And that's basically it for techniques of artworks and posters. So until next time, I'll see you later.